I'm reading from Lives of the Dead, collected poems of Hanoch Levin. In the car to my father's funeral, my uncle told me that I really should translate this book of poems called Lives of the Dead. He's not a man who reads poetry, but he'd read this book and he'd liked it. As had many people, it had gone through several editions in Israel. The following year, I translated Ecclesiastes as a way of dealing with my father's death, and it is a sober meditation on death as you could imagine. I then came across Lives of the Dead again, having avoided it, despite my uncle's suggestions. A year later, the humour of this book, and particularly the long-titled poem, spoke to me, rather more than in the Year of Mourning, and the tone of delicacy, scatological cruelty, and wistful sadness attracted me. I took Ecclesiastes to be a poem trying hard to find a meaning in life, all but failing, and only finally turning to the necessity of faith in God. In Hanoch Levin's poems, especially in Lives of the Dead, I found a profane, rude, unavoidably direct and modern answer to Ecclesiastes, a look at death by someone who very much did not believe in the afterlife, but nevertheless saw and expressed all the hopes which even the most irreligious keep in the deepest, most secret closet of their heart. What, didn't you know that after death there's a summer camp and God is the lifeguard? I'll read just the first 4 lines at the beginning of Lives of the Dead in Hebrew and my translation, and then I'll read chapter 2. It's in 4 chapters. חיי המתים, פואמה. שמל מוכר לברל, ברל קונה מגצל, ובתוך כולם, כמו חור בתוך בייגל, הקץ, המכונה גם קצל. Lives of the Dead, an epic. Shmerl sells to Beryl, and Beryl buys from Getzel. And inside of them all, like a hole inside the bagel, is death, also known as Detzel. Chapter 1 of Lives of the Dead concerns the journey of the dead man on a cart down the path to the grave, through the graveyard. Chapter 2 begins with him settled in his new abode. Chapter 2. And the man said, "What is the dead man left, if not to be philosophical? I have plenty of time here at my disposal to solve the deep meaning of it all." The man peeped inside himself and knew, in this life there is no riddle. In the darkness of a sealed hole, in the small, sad world of his flesh's dispersal, the dead man manages his miserable, dead existence. And as will happen to a man asleep with his mouth open who dreams a dream, so a friendly wise guy stops of a sudden overhead and drops his pants to take a leak in his mouth for a lark. And the sleeping man leaps up in pained surprise and shakes his head and spits and wipes the ordure from his mouth. And for a moment the human world is lit before him with a burning glow, nauseating. Thus the mud is stuffed and the water drawn to fill the hollow in the open mouth of the dead man. And the dead man does not jump and does not spit and does not protest. And only the pained surprise on his face does not fade. And the dead man got sick with sorrow and his flesh wasted away, and his pale lips ate back from the rim of his mouth, and his teeth bared a foolish grin. And for all he tried to shut his grin, that smile of the embarrassed dead, apologetic, to swathe his face in a severe frown of wrath, as befits one in pain, the more his teeth unveiled, and the grin broadened and stretched from ear to ear, and became the twisted, crude laugh of a good-for-nothing. All the dead lie flat, laughing crudely toward heaven, And if they saw over them hope wink like a troop of ugly women chortling at a disco, at the bad joke of a fat man without a penny, while in their hearts there's bitterness. And the dead man takes to heart the fact that he will not soon rise from this hole, and a long time more he'll pass in tortuous lying on his back without a stir. So he says, how shall a man spend his death? What remains, if not to ponder, study and resolve the riddle of his days? For the lives of the dead are good and fit to think thoughts. He's solitary, a confirmed bachelor for the rest of his days. Children and milkmen don't bother him. His organ doesn't jump and his heart does not beat and his brain is not flooded with the poisoned blood of lust. And he's not worried about his health. He's not conflicted about the puzzle of what's preferable, gymnastics or swimming. And he bears a certain resemblance to a poet, sitting at the foot of a mountain, staring at the sky revealed between the tops of the trees, and drawing analogies to the mountain and casting them in rhyme schemes, till suddenly the mountain falls on him and buries him beneath it. And he continues lying in the poet's swoon and keeps musing on the mountain, only this time with no analogies and no rhyme scheme. Then the dead man lights the dim lantern of his memory that tends to gutter, and illumines the dark ends of his soul that are covered in death's cold mosses, to rummage after the secret of his life, its joy, sorrow, and meaning. But as the man gnaws through his soul is full of magazines. In all the basement of his soul roll only tatters of magazines, and piles of newspapers fill even the hidden chambers of his heart that are unknown. How the man's soul longs for an evening paper, his daily bread at noon while life he lived. Ah, the juicy headlines, wafting smells of meat and spices, and oh, the little typeface, sweet and crisp, melting in your mouth. And at noon he grasped the evening paper, and his hand brushed it even at night time, and even the next day he fondled it a bit, like the mechanic fondling of an old lover. So newspapers filled him till there was not room for anything else. Even at noon on the day of his death, while still he lived in sweat, the man read as he sat to his repast lots of news items about what was happening in Iran and the family of the Shah of Iran, and about the American reaction, and about the strange dealings between the ministers of trade and treasury in our fair land. These were the last things his soul pondered, the man who lived at noon on the day of his death. He didn't understand how the Shah of Iran got to where he got to, and in this confusion over the Shah of Iran, death jumped on him suddenly in all its rage. And when the man set to deciphering his life's meaning, he saw the Shah of Iran peep at him from his soul's cellars. He and his wife and his 3 children had applied there for asylum, and the Minister of Trade and Treasury and noted matchmaker Venus Katz, and many more presidents and ministers and generals and members of Parliament, and pimps and car thieves and television presenters and football players, they and their wives and their kids in a great milling multitude, with all the ordure accompanying them from the depths of the newspapers, and their squealing and parading in the cellars of the soul of the dead man, and eating and moving their bowels and making a mess. They spit and suppurate, and the ceiling of the dead man's soul is begrimed, smeared with the vapour of these people and their sweat, that rises in a stink from the prattle of their mouths and breath of their noses, and from their armpits and holes in their loins and goop between their toenails. And the floor of the dead man's soul is rank with the spat out shells and crumbs and empty sweet wrappers of men and piss of children trailing after them with noses running. And the man knew that he'd been cheated by the world, and that he'd no foundation and data from which to decipher life's meaning, that his soul was shaped like an army crapper, where there's an endless shortage of tissue, and so many torn ends of evening newspaper. Roll there, and every tear of newspaper contains a tail end of crumpled news or squished story, and is wiped in the middle with a good wipe, and rolls on the earth to where it wants to. The Shah of Iran laughed, and his children laughed in turn, and the ministers of trade and treasury laughed one by one, and Venus' cats laughed, and she's already pairing up a laughing man with a woman busting a gut, and around them a multitude laughs and cheers and celebrates, and the dead man cried a desperate cry for his base life that was lost, and no one heard the dead man's awful moan, for it was choked in the hollow of his mouth that was stuffed with earth. And not a sound was heard at the graveside, and there was silence, except for a little simmering, a whispering hiss like the sound of a silent fart, like the sound of a flute that plays so quiet, till all that's heard is the flautist's breath, which is the voice of the body that's sadly rotting, and makes such a sad, romantic noise. And the dead man was shown as an empty vessel, and the riddle of his base life was a footpad for the soles of the shoes of the relations of the Shah of Iran, and his lips lay lapped within a grin the exchange rate of the dollar and the price of kerosene.